When I come into a courtroom like this and I see the witness box, it reminds me how powerful it is when somebody sits there and they describe what they personally saw, what they personally experienced. And it makes me think about Leo Carter. When I was a reporter for the Chicago Tribune, I met Leo Carter. He'd been a young teenager in the inner city of Chicago, and one day he saw a young man by the name of Elijah Baptiste, murder a grocer. And young Leo Carter knew that he had a responsibility to see that justice is done. He had a responsibility to sit in a jury box and to point out Elijah Baptiste as the murderer of that grocer. But he knew there were risks. And Elijah Baptiste also knew how powerful eyewitness testimony could be. He knew if he wanted to remain a free man, he had to eliminate Leo Carter. So Elijah Baptiste and his gang went hunting one day, and they came upon Leo Carter and Leo Carter's brother and a friend of theirs, and they herded all three of them into an alley. And then Elijah Baptiste's cousin took a gun, and he put it to the bridge of Leo Carter's nose, and he pulled the trigger. And the bullet entered at a slight angle, and it blinded Leo in his right eye, and it embedded in his skull, and Leo collapsed to the ground. And then the same gunman shot him again, and the bullet lodged just inches from his spine. But Leo wasn't dead. And Leo, from that sprawl position, watched as Elijah Baptiste and his gang murdered his brother and murdered their friend in cold blood. And when the day came, Leo Carter sat in a witness box like that, and he pointed to Elijah Baptiste and said, "He is the man who murdered the grocer." And he was convicted of murder. And then he got up and he said, Elijah Baptiste and his gang, who he pointed out, they're the ones that shot me and left me for dead and killed my brother and killed my friend. And Elijah Baptiste and his gang were convicted once again of murder and sent away to prison where they will never again see freedom. That is the power of eyewitness testimony. And Leo Carter is a hero of mine. To this day, that bullet is lodged in his skull. To this day, he's blind in his right eye. But he did the right thing. Well, sometimes I think about eyewitness testimony in terms of the case for Christ. I entered this investigation of the evidence for Jesus as a skeptic, as an atheist. And I wanted to know, is there any testimony like Leo Carter's that's powerful, that points toward Jesus Christ actually having lived and actually having done miracles and being resurrected from the dead? And I found that there are reliable records that have been preserved about Jesus Christ. In fact, there are 4 biographies of Jesus that we call the 4 Gospels. They're found in the New Testament of the Bible. They're written by Matthew. He was an eyewitness to the life of Jesus Christ. He'd been a tax collector. He became a disciple. He watched these things, and he wrote down what he saw. There was Mark. Mark was a close companion of the eyewitness Peter, who was in the inner circle of Jesus. And he wrote down the things that Peter told him from his own firsthand experience. There was Luke. Luke was sort of a first-century journalist. He was a close companion of another eyewitness, and that is Paul, who was an eyewitness to the resurrected Jesus Christ. And he was very careful, he said, to write down exactly what he knew to be true. He went back to the original sources, to the original witnesses, and wrote down their accounts of what happened. And then there's John. John also was in the inner circle of Jesus Christ. He knew what happened. He saw things with his own eyes, and he recorded them for us to read. Now, it's important to say that these Gospels, these biographies, originally were anonymous. In other words, names weren't attached to them. But there were no competitors in the first century claiming that somebody else wrote these biographies. From the earliest days, it was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who everybody knew wrote these things. In fact, when you think about it, there would be no reason for anybody to make up these authors. Because think about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Nobody would have made up Matthew as the author of a gospel. As a tax collector, he came from a hated profession. The last person you would say wrote a gospel if he hadn't really done it. And why would you choose Mark and Luke? They themselves weren't eyewitnesses. They recorded the writings of people who were eyewitnesses. Why wouldn't you attach names like, oh, this was written by Mary, or this was written himself by Peter or by James? Well, we see that kind of thing happening in the centuries that followed. as apocryphal gospels, fanciful gospels were made up, and names of highly respected disciples were attached to them. But in the first century, they said, no, you know what? It was Matthew, Mark, Luke who wrote those first three gospels. And one of the reasons we know that it's true that they did is they're not the people who you would have made up as the authors if it weren't true. Now, that authorship is also confirmed by writers in 125 AD and in 180 AD who affirm these are the people who actually wrote these important biographies of Jesus. But one of the issues comes up is, well, if these things were written down a long time after Jesus lived, then perhaps legend and mythology grew up in the interim and distorted what it is they wrote. Well, let me preface what I'm about to say by talking about another historical figure by the name of Alexander the Great. The two earliest biographies of Alexander the Great are written by Arrian and Plutarch, and they're written 400 years after the life of Alexander the Great, and yet they are considered to be generally reliable in what they report. The legendary material about Alexander the Great didn't develop until after that 400-year period. Now, look at the case of the biographies of Jesus Christ. Even liberal theologians say that Mark wrote his gospel in 70 AD, Matthew and Luke in the 80s, and John in the 90s. Now, Jesus was put to death in either 33 or 30 AD, so you have a gap of about 40 to 60 years. Now, that's nothing when you compare it to the 400 years in the case of Arrian and Plutarch, and yet their writings are generally considered reliable about Alexander the Great. Here we have a much closer time frame in the case of the Gospels. So certainly it's some good evidence that they're equally reliable, let's say, as Arrian and Plutarch. But we can do even better than that. There's very good evidence, I believe, that these biographies of Jesus were written much earlier to the life of Jesus than some liberal and left-wing theologians claim. And let me explain to you how I know this to be true. The Bible contains a book called the Book of Acts. It records the early happenings of the church. This book ends with the Apostle Paul under house arrest in Rome. And then it suddenly ends. We don't know what happens to Paul. Now, we know historically that Paul was put to death about 62 AD. So certainly Acts must have been written and finished before that took place, because certainly it would have recorded the death of Paul had that occurred while Acts was being recorded. So if we can date the book of Acts to about 62 AD, that seems about right. Now, the person who wrote the book of Acts is Luke. Luke also wrote the Gospel of Luke, the biography of Luke called the Gospel of Luke. That was written before the book of Acts, so we can move closer in time to the life of Jesus. Now, we know that in writing his biography, Luke also took some material from Mark. So we knew that Mark is written even closer to the life of Jesus than that. So now we're backing it up. We're probably in the late 50s AD. We know that Mark also took his passion narrative, that is, his writing about the crucifixion of Jesus Christ in the empty tomb. Scholars believe that he took that from another source that can be dated back by some scholars as early as 37 AD. And remember, Jesus was put to death in 30 or 33 AD. So now you see we have a very small time gap, a time gap so small that legend could not have grown up that fast and wiped out a solid core of historical truth. We know that from studies that scholars have done into the rate at which legend accrued in the ancient world. What am I saying through all of this? What I'm saying is simply this, that these biographies of Jesus Christ were written so close to the life of Jesus, and they were written by people who were either themselves eyewitnesses or who were close companions writing down the accounts of eyewitnesses. And when you look at these accounts, they not only have a ring of truth, but in my book called The Case for Christ, I subject them to 8 different tests of evidence, just like would be done in a court of law. And these biographies of Jesus Christ pass each of these 8 tests with flying colors. So what's my conclusion? As I mentioned, I came into this as a skeptic. I came in as an atheist. I didn't want to conclude that these biographies of Jesus Christ are reliable. But as I looked at them objectively, and as I subjected the tests of evidence, subjected those tests to these writings, I couldn't help but conclude that the biographies of Jesus Christ are historical documents upon which we can rely for information about the life, the teachings, the miracles, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Next time when we get together, we're going to resume. We're going to talk about more evidence in the case for Christ. Right now, let's call a recess in court, and I'll see you next time.